for that, Victoria. It's very kind. As Victoria said, my name's Lynn Campbell and I'm a conservator. Anybody here seen the repair shop? Yeah. That's not what a conservator does. I'll just let you know now. But I'm actually English. I come from the west of England, and I arrived here 30 years ago for 2 years to work at the Robert McDougall Art Gallery, and I'm still here. They can't get rid of me. But really, I'd like to talk to you about how to, if you're interested, on how to actually become a conservator. If anybody's interested in how the repair shop is different from being an actual conservator, talk to me about it later, because that's more of a restoration program rather than actual hands-on conservation. So anyway, to be able to, where are we? To be a conservator, you really need to know what cultural conservation is. And a lot of people get very confused between conservators that restore and conserve heritage objects with conservation that deals with trees and plants. It is significantly different. It's really the history of tangible and intangible objects. Up until 1966, or the 60s, it may not be 66, with the advent of the Florence floods, people suddenly realized that there were not people out there that could conserve all this damaged material. And that was really the beginning of academic conservation. It explains you can actually work on things that are thousands, hundreds of years old. So it's actually a very exciting job. It can also be very tense. What does it really entail? You have either a couple of options. From the 60s, many of the conservators were hands-on remedial conservators. So they would actually sit at a table and conserve an object at a time. Later on, people realized that that really didn't make much sense, and that it made much more sense to actually prevent things from being damaged in the first instance. So there are two very distinct arms to cultural conservation. One, the hands-on remedial treatment, the other, the preventive measures that you can go through. So conserving works, what you need really, you really do sort of require some sort of understanding of chemistry and physics, biology, but equally, particularly if you're interested in the fine art side of conservation, like painting conservation, textiles or paper, you do need to have some sort of artistic manual dexterity. I trained in Newcastle upon Tyne in the UK, and there were 7 of us on the course for paper, and there were 7 for paintings. And of the students, it was myself with my fine art degree, 3 art history students, a physics student, and a chemistry student. So they are open to lots of different types of degrees in relation to carrying on to training conservation. Remedial treatment, that's the hands-on treatment. That's where you actually get your hands dirty and actually are able to pick the objects up. So this involves things like, it's not just weighing in. You really have to make sure you've taken all your hands-on photography treatment. You have to do a condition report to make sure that the object is in a fit state. Sounds weird, but in a fit state to actually conserve. You don't want to cause further damage to it. There's a proposed treatment, and you actually treat the objects. You never quite know what you're going to come across with certain things, particularly paper. Although I did used to say that paper was the most fragile of all the types of specialization in conservation. There is one that's worse, and that's photography. Conservation of historic photographs can be quite hair-raising. Why do you photograph? You always photograph to make sure that you've actually made a record of what you've been doing to the object, because no matter what you do, as little or as much as you do, you still interfere with the object. So it's quite good to have a history of what it looked like before, anything interesting that happens during treatment, and any after photographs. The painting conservation tends to be the one that can always look the most dramatic because the oil paint generally has a varnish on it. Once the painting conservator takes that varnish off, the painting can look virtually new. You don't get that with a lot of the other conservation treatments, particularly paper. The condition report is a sort of archive of what's being done to it, what's wrong with it, have there been any previous treatments. That's the sort of thing you need to be able to ascertain. And you also need to be able to deal with treatment reports, because 20 years down the track, someone else could come along and decide they're going to treat it again. And the treatment that you've done could possibly affect the treatment 20 years down the track. My first week at Newcastle, we were happily there given a nice little print each, because we were all paper conservators, happily given this print, and we all happily were following each other, deacidifying it and bleaching the paper. And then we all gaily went off for our cup of tea and came back, and every single print where there had been what's called a type of mold called foxing on it had turned, every foxing spot on all 5 of them had turned bright purple. So that was a bit of a surprise, especially when it's your first week on the course. But after some research, we actually discovered that in the past, conservators of the 60s used to use this solution called potassium permanganate in relation, and they used to use it with something called oxalic acid, which is a chelating agent. They had actually treated all these prints with potassium permanganate and oxalic acid, and when we washed them, we'd washed the oxalic acid off, and it had left all these bright purple spots of the potassium permanganate. So it's really good to know with a treatment report what's gone before, just in case it could impact. Another good example of that is during the 30s, 40s and 50s, there was a lack of graphite due to the war. So a lot of artists of that era started using laundry markers. And of course, if you get laundry markers wet from that era, they can go blue or bright purple. So that's the sort of information you need to know in the future. We'll go through that. So again, that's why you need all that information about treatment reports. Now, there is another side to conservation, and that is preventive conservation. And you're thinking, what's that? Well, it's basically methods to prevent heritage from deteriorating in the first place. It involves including controlling light levels, handling, display, disaster preparedness, all that sort of all those processes. You can actually stop things deteriorating. I mean, you can't stop them completely, but you can actually, in the end, slow the processes down. Light levels. New Zealand's got the highest light levels, UV light levels in the world, apart from Antarctica. And so it can actually be quite an issue to protect, particularly organic materials like paper, textiles, from deteriorating because of light. When I arrived here, I brought all my art books from the UK, and I put them in this study where we were in the flat we were in. I thought, these are not. I'd had these books about 20 years. Within a month of them being in that study, all the spines had faded. So that's the sort of thing you're dealing with. The environment, temperature, humidity, mold, all that sort of material can affect pollution. Pollution, particularly in relation to historic photographs, anything that involves silver can be affected by atmospheric pollution. Off-gassing, wood, sulfur, paints, all that can affect historic objects. The other thing that people were discovering, that some of the things picture framers, I mean, they didn't know any better, they didn't know, but the pictures were actually being endangered by the way that the pictures were framed and displayed. So conservators look at that sort of thing as well and advise on whether to use the right materials. Training. This is sort of the bad news. There is no actually training programs in New Zealand for conservation, cultural conservation. The closest two are, there's one in Canberra and there's one in Melbourne. There's also quite a few in the UK. Well, there used to be, there's not so many now, but the one in Newcastle, which is fine art. Then you get places like York and the northern, there's another one up there that I've forgotten about, but they do other types of historic conservation, archaeology in particular. The Australian ones at Canberra and Melbourne are quite overreaching, so they do tend to look at all types of objects, but generally in the end you will specialise in something like paintings, glass, textiles. So, and this information's here if you're remotely interested. The UK includes Westdean. That's Westdean College is quite a practical one. They also deal with book conservation and archive conservation, which again is another specialisation. And the one I went to was in Northumbria. There are also many, many courses in the USA and Canada, but again, fortunately, none here. Most of these courses are postgraduate, so you really need a degree to start off with. So they love chemistry, physics, fine art, art history. That's the ones I think they're really after. I'm pretty sure the Canberra and Melbourne do an undergraduate one, but I think they encourage you to stay on to do the postgraduate one as well. Again, going back to the repair shop, I find it a very interesting program because you can tell who the conservators are. Well, I know one of them, so I would, but there's a wide myriad of different types of restoration there. So you get the apprentices, which and then you can get the enthusiastic volunteers, and then you get the actual conservators. And but in terms of conservation, restoration, the things they do are a very tiny proportion of what a conservator would do if they trained in it. And I think that's it. If you've got any queries, give me a shout, but I'll ask some at the end if you've got any questions. Thank you.